Chapter 12. Going for Growth. We had done it. After all the policy papers, 2 books, a bruising leadership campaign, and the disappointments of successive Conservative governments and chancellors, we had finally delivered a Conservative package of tax cuts and supply-side reform that was going to mark a major shift in government policy and signify a new era. As we were driven down to Ebbsfleet in Kent to see new houses being built, I felt a sense of elation. Next to me, Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng was grinning from ear to ear. Kwasi had just announced the Growth Plan, which has since become known as the mini-budget, in the House of Commons. We had pushed into the timing of the announcement by events. Because of the hiatus in government caused by the demise of Boris and the long leadership election, the issues in the in-tray had been piling up. In particular, energy was a major problem. Because of years of short-termist policies, the UK had been left exposed to a massive global spike in energy prices. We had announced our energy package 2 days into the government and had promised to provide costings with a fiscal event in the ensuing weeks. Then, of course, the Queen had died and the country had gone into a period of mourning. Soon we would be up against party conference season, when politicians desert London for their annual weeks away with their respective party activists in a conference centre. We had a narrow window to spell out our economic plans between my return from the UN General Assembly the previous day and the start of the Labour Party conference on Saturday. Time was not on our side. I fundamentally believe that elections are won on the basis of what is happening on the ground, not messaging about future prospects. And things were not feeling good. Growth had been stagnant. The average Briton was no better off than they were in 2007, and indeed £10,000 per year worse off than the equivalent American. The state was spending too much, almost half of the country's national income. In order to move things in the right direction, serious action was going to have to be taken that autumn. However, this is not to say our economic plans were generated on the hoof. In fact, they had long been in gestation. My fellow authors and I had laid out the strategy in our book Britannia Unchained, Global Lessons for Growth and Prosperity, published exactly 10 years previously in September of 2012. One of those authors was Kwasi himself, and he and I had spent years discussing this agenda. As we put it in the introduction to the book, changing Britain's fortunes needs a relentless energy and determined focus. Vitally, we will need to be tougher in taking on vested interests. We have to ensure that the general climate for business is attractive. This means that we should stop indulging in irrelevant debates about sharing the pie between manufacturing and services, the North and the South, women and men. Instead, we should focus on trying to make it easier for firms to recruit people and ensuring the tax burden is less onerous. I believe those things were needed then, and if anything, I believe them even more after 10 years in government. The task was now more urgent. Brexit made it imperative that we should tackle the underlying problems that were stopping Britain from becoming more competitive. Otherwise, we were simply accepting decline. Kwasi and I had both been members of Boris's cabinet, he as business secretary and me as international trade secretary. We had sat there in frustration as the then Chancellor Rishi Sunak raised taxes and blocked serious supply-side reform. We had lobbied Boris not to go ahead with corporation tax rises or windfall taxes, but while claiming to sympathise, he was deeply reluctant to take it on the Treasury. The biggest row was when Sunak had sought to introduce an entirely new tax, the Health and Social Care Levy. There were rumours during the summer of 2021 that national insurance was going to be hiked to pay for the NHS. I had been a long-time campaigner against national insurance. At the first Conservative Party conference I had attended back in 1997, I had made a platform speech against it with Margaret Thatcher looking on. It was a fake tax, claiming to be an insurance against unemployment and sickness. In fact, it was just another way of fleecing the British public, with money going into the public spending black hole. Ahead of that cabinet meeting in September 2021, there were lots of attempts by Boris and Dan Rosenfield, his chief of staff, to persuade me not to speak out against the tax rise. It was even hindered by Boris's allies that I wouldn't want to put my potential promotion to Foreign Secretary in jeopardy. But I insisted on saying my piece. I had not joined the Tory party and become an MP to raise taxes. The justification given for creating the new health and social care levy, according to Sunak, was that it was needed to balance numbers from the Office for Budget Responsibility, the OBR. This was a red rag to a bull. I pointed out that the OBR forecasts always turn out to be wrong, that we had promised not to raise taxes in our manifesto, and that Conservatives who raise taxes don't win elections. I was backed up by only 2 other cabinet ministers, Lord Frost and Jacob Rees-Mogg. After my comments, Boris said he agreed with me and Sunak. Classic. It was very clear that the answer to Britain's fiscal problems, i.e., that spending was exceeding tax revenues, was not more taxes and bigger government. It was liberating the supply side of the economy to generate more growth and income while holding down government spending. I knew all this would be difficult to implement because the whole agenda was deeply unfashionable in economic circles. Over time, the lessons of the 1980s and the Thatcherite rolling back of overtaxation and regulation have seemingly been forgotten. The tide had been going on for free market economics. We had bailed out the bankers after the financial crash, which had been used by the left to discredit free markets. From the Occupy movement to the works of Thomas Piketty, anti-capitalist arguments had been making the running. The left used cultural and environmental movements to undermine personal responsibility and capitalist economics. We saw the development of wokenomics, where big businesses were more focused on so-called environmental, social, and governance objectives than making money. Industry has become increasingly corporatized, going to government for grants and lobbying to retain regulation to keep out competitors. Instead of taking on the leftists and allowing failing companies to feel the discipline of the market, Conservatives had capitulated to them. Central banks from the Federal Reserve to the Bank of England colluded with spendthrift governments, allowing money printing to pay for the Grease. Conservatives lost their economic compass and their grasp of basic economic principles, often demanding more regulation and buying into the left-wing spend and subsidize model. When I talked about supply-side reform, it was met with eye rolls from my own parliamentary colleagues. This tendency was exacerbated by the response to the pandemic. UK government spending as a proportion of GDP is now an eye-watering 46%. By the time I won the contest to lead the Conservative Party in the summer of 2022, the chickens were coming home to roost. The UK was becoming less competitive and relatively poorer. Energy and housing prices were some of the highest in Europe. Roads and rails took longer to build and were more expensive. The high-speed 2 rail line between London and the West Midlands was estimated to have cost 10 times its French equivalent. We are not allowed fracking and consequently have energy prices that are twice what they are in the US. Add to that the fact that, despite my best efforts, our workers face the highest childcare costs in Europe, and it had become inordinately difficult for companies and organisations to open a bank account, yet more evidence that it's getting harder to get things done, which slows down progress. After some attempts to cut regulation in the early years, red tape had grown under the Conservatives. Successive governments had given in to pressure for more nanny state measures such as sugar taxes, anti-money laundering rules, data protection regulations, and a host of other measures that have added to the burden. These regulations and costs have had the effect of hampering our manufacturing industry, deterring investment, and driving up the cost of living for ordinary Britons. The administrative state has accumulated huge numbers of power. The Conservatives' planned bonfire of the Quangos, there are still hundreds of unelected Quangos in Britain, have been snuffed out as long ago as 2011 by lefty claims that we were seeking to abolish forests. Blair and Brown had imposed a web of legalistic architecture that added process and put more power in the hands of the technocrats. We did not reverse any of this legislation. In fact, we added our own. Brexit offered a huge opportunity to deal with this legacy of red tape. It would clearly be on benefit to the UK economy if regulations like the Working Time Directive were repealed. But we have been too timid in taking that opportunity. The vast majority of EU law remains on the British statute book. It's a bit like getting divorced and then continuing to live in the same house as your ex-husband. The West has been growing slowly for years, and Britain was among the worst laggards. We urgently needed to change the trajectory if we were to have any chance of seeing results by the time of the next general election. That meant returning to the promises on which we had been elected in 2019, like keeping corporation tax low and reversing the planned increase in national insurance. It meant getting serious about other supply-side reforms that would boost growth. It meant increasing the productive capacity of the economy and setting the conditions necessary for higher economic growth. It's a simple enough concept, but achieving it has not always proved to be easy. I wanted to defeat the sense that things simply weren't happening in Britain and that we were stuck in a rut. It's why I made the theme of our 2022 party conference Get Britain Moving. As well as needing a huge cultural shift, our other problem was that the institutional machinery had completely bought into the big government high tax approach that had been cemented during 30 years of economic consensus. I called out the Treasury orthodox during the leadership election, and this probably didn't do me any favours with the officials with whom Kwasi and I would have to work. His Majesty's Treasury is a much more powerful body than its equivalent in other countries because it compromises both the economic and accounting functions of the government. No other country has a system like this. The US equivalent would be having the White House Office of Management and Budget, the US Treasury and the Congressional Budget Office all rolled into one and headed up by civil servants. This setup has been a problem for Britain for years. Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson tried to break it up by establishing a separate Department of Economic Affairs in the 1960s. He failed. The situation we now faced was not only that the Treasury orthodoxy had shifted to the left and away from the free market economics we wished to pursue, but that the power of the Treasury orthodoxy had grown under Blair and Brown. The Treasury had spread its tentacles over domestic policy. This meant cabinet ministers not only had a spending cap in their departments, but they also had to go to the Treasury for permission as to how to spend the money. They had also given the Governor of the Bank of England much greater powers, including making him virtually unsackable during his 5-year term of office, since extended by George Osborne to be an 8-year term. Although the Treasury is responsible for setting the Bank of England's mandate for monetary policy, I saw in my time that there was talking about it and it had become a taboo. During the leadership election, I questioned its mandate and the period of cheap money that they had anesthetized the country. According to some people, this was akin to questioning PayPal authority. Any attempt to talk about it was considered a challenge to the bank's independence. If only the words attributed to Mayor Amschel Rothschild of the famous banking family had been heeded. Permit me to issue and control the money of a nation, and I care not who makes its laws. The OBR was set up by George Osborne, the Chancellor in the coalition government following the 2010 general election. Although it was to mark the government's forecasting homework, it gradually developed a life of its own, and now essentially sets fiscal policy. I'm not aware of any other treasury anywhere in the world with such a rigid and inflexible arrangement. Both the Bank of England and the OBR are infused with the same treasury orthodoxy, but as independent institutions. They are not subject to challenge from elected politicians. Their actions move markets and affect people's lives. But instead of being robustly scrutinized, their pronouncements are treated with the same reverency that is given to other technocratic institutions nowadays. These bodies all instinctively have the same mindset. They were the remaining in the EU and now want to stick as closely to the EU law as possible. They are pro-China and generally against using economic measures to shape geopolitics. They agree with top-down tinkering and are more interested in balancing the books than growing the economy. They are also pro-immigration, seeing that as a way of fixing the public finances. They are fatalistic about Britain's decline, and they don't believe in Britain's manufacturing industry. At one instructive meeting, after we failed to reach a conclusion on what to do to defend ourselves against unfair trade practices in the steel industry, as exasperated, Boris interjected, "Put your hands up, those who want a steel industry in Britain." The Treasury officials who were disputing for Sunak sat on their hands. Because these bodies believe the level of economic growth is a given, they underplay the importance of incentives. But incentives matter hugely. Put simply, if we push up taxes to 80% or put up so much regulation in place that operating a business becomes almost impossible, fewer people will aspire to earn more or start a new business. Different incentives have different levels of responsiveness. While most working people are fixed in terms of their ties to a particular place and cannot easily move abroad to a lower tax country, large businesses and big capital tend to be more mobile. It is much easier for a multinational company like AstraZeneca to relocate and open new facilities in Ireland rather than the UK because Ireland's corporation tax is lower. That is why changes to business taxes, regulation, and the top rates of personal income tax are particularly sensitive. No one who has had to deal with this hideous hell of the OBR forecasting process understands just how bad it is. I saw it firsthand as Chief Secretary and then had the opportunity to look under the bonnet as Prime Minister. The Treasury forecasting process was always overly statistic. Margaret Thatcher's Chancellor Nigel Lawson explained in his memoirs how in the 1980s Treasury ministers took steps to prevent nonsensical and absurd Treasury forecasts from seeing the light of day, insisting that more realistic figures be published instead. But at least there was an opportunity for internal debate about the impact of taxes and regulation. Now that expertise has been stripped from the Treasury, and the forecasting is carried out in isolation from the policymakers. It takes place at 2-week intervals during the run-up to a fiscal event. The Treasury can go from having £20 billion extra to spend to being £20 billion short simply because some intermediate figure or number has changed. The OBR's models are statistic and short-terminist. They underestimate the effect that tax and regulation have on people's behaviour, and they tend to focus on the 1 or 2 or at the most 5-year effects of policy. I call this approach abacus economics. They tell us who the winners and losers will be from changes to tax rates, but do not give sufficient weight to how those changes will boost growth overall. This means, bluntly, that their numbers are frequently wrong. This had an impact on the debate during the leadership contest. Sunak's team claimed my plans would increase borrowing and add to the national debt. Those attacks were based on flawed OBR modelling. As a former Chancellor, Sunak entirely bought into this orthodoxy, while I sought to challenge it. I agreed we need to get debt falling in the medium term, but I believe the Treasury plan was for doing so based on a blinkered view of how the fiscal and regulatory framework affects growth. They consistently underestimate the negative effects of taxes and regulation. Squeezing more money out of the economy in the short term with tax raises might seem a prudent way to reduce the budget deficit, but it risks killing the goose that lays the golden egg. You might get decent returns in years 1 and 2, but after that business leave, entrepreneurship is choked off, growth stalls, and revenue fall. In due course, we were to hear more about the workings of the OBR. On Friday the 30th September, Kwasi and I met with the OBR to talk about the medium-term fiscal plan we were developing to ensure debt was falling. The OBR was clear that tax-raising measures were a more certain source of income than cutting government spending, and that government spending had a more direct effect on growth than money in the private sector. In short, it was very Keynesian. They were not prepared to score supply-side measures to any significant level. The plans we had put forward to deregulate and reduce Britain's energy costs would have significantly increased growth, but the OBR did not agree. there was only one supply-side measure they thought significantly contributed to the economy: immigration. I agreed with Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, that we needed to get tough on immigration. Legal migration was far too high. In fact, net migration reached 700,000 in 2022 and 600,000 in 2023. Despite immigration and border control being one of the main concerns of voters, the post-Brexit immigration regime was far too generous. Students were allowed to stay for 2 years after studying in the UK and allowed to bring dependents, including up to 4 children. Salary thresholds were too low at £26,000, lower than the average British wage. The Home Office was also resistant to differentiating between countries. I wanted to see easier travel in both directions between the UK and both Australia and Japan, which is a very different proposition to a similar arrangement with much less economically developed countries. The system we had in place was down to much pressure from the Treasury and business departments, which were constantly lobbied by business and universities for cheap labour and a steady supply of international students. Then Chancellor Sunak backed his official's position. Illegal immigration was also a huge problem. Human traffickers were shipping illegal migrants over the English Channel in small boats. We had a plan to send these migrants to Rwanda, a country with which the UK government had done a deal under previous Home Secretary Priti Patel, but implementing this deal was continually held up by internal resistance and legal cases in the courts. I had agreed with Suella that we needed a series of measures to bring the immigration numbers down. She was determined to get it to below 100,000. These measures would include stopping students from bringing dependents and raising the salary thresholds. To tackle illegal immigration, we would also need to take on the legal establishment. If we were to break this impasse over the Rwanda deal, we would need a notwithstanding clause to disapply elements of the European Convention on Human Rights, under the same legal doctrine of necessity that we had used for the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill. The OBR was an obstacle to getting it done, because the OBR's faulty numbers, which view immigration as a positive for the public finances and don't take account of the strain of the public services or indeed the GDP per capita impact, every step to reduce immigration would make their forecasts look worse. Therefore, the government would be obliged to cut spending or raise taxes to compensate for reducing immigration. It was literally through the looking glass stuff. If numbers were reduced as Suella had outlined, the OBR claimed this would add £10 billion to the deficit and therefore necessitate spending cuts or tax raises. These calculations, that I believed were wrong, were providing the tramlines for government policy. The arguments Kwasi and I were making were not novel or eccentric. They'd been proved right by the experiences of the 1970s and 1980s. And for a time they were accepted wisdom. But somehow the economic establishment had either forgotten or repudiated them in the years since. Hence, we arrived at a situation where my laying out these basic tenets of free market economics during my pitch to become Prime Minister was painted as some sort of untested heresy. Despite all these flaws, the Prime Minister and Chancellor essentially have no alternative but the OBR for forecasting. Other government departments are not able to do their own forecasts, as I found when I was International Trade Secretary. According to the legislation, the OBR has to produce a twice-yearly forecast of the public finances. If the government decided to commission a different body to do a forecast, I suspect it would cause an uproar. As I saw for myself, unelected independent bodies are trusted more than politicians, so that argument would be lost. Therefore, even though I believe the forecasting process was fundamentally wrong, and even though I believe the numbers were a fiction, I could not denounce them without putting the government in an even trickier position. There is a deeper problem then, even than the flawed forecasting. It is that the media and wider establishment appear to believe that the future can be predicted this way. They put far too much faith in forecasts. Similar mistakes were made around the modelling for COVID, which evidence now suggests projected 4 times as many people would be infected without a lockdown as we really were the case. This flawed modelling was taken as gospel by the government machine and media alike, and was instrumental in unprecedented decisions being made to curtail personal freedoms, on the basis of supposedly preventing hundreds of thousands of deaths. I believed in what I was doing from a point of first principles, but very few are prepared to engage in an argument at that level. They prefer instead to engage in monkey tennis around competing predictions of the future. I could not tell you precisely how many jobs would be created in particular parts of the country over the next decade, or what new technologies and products would be developed by businesses during that time. But I do know that a 19% rate of corporation tax is much better than one of 25%, and that easing the burden of regulation and taxation will result in better growth. Rather than argue about the forecasts, I wanted to get on and prove it. After years of being thwarted by the process of officialdom, Quasi and I knew that getting past the orthodoxy would be a major problem. However, while we were thinking in terms of how to actually make the policies actually happen, we underestimated the wider fallout about being seen to take on the establishment. That's why all the work we did in the limited preparation time we had was about how to enact the policies and not so much about how to sell them. In between leadership election hustlings, I had been rushing back to the Foreign Secretary's rural retreat of Shevling, where we had a few weeks to work out how to approach all of this. We were there with Treasury officials, many of whom I knew from my time as Chief Secretary. Supportive Cabinet colleagues Jacob Rees-Mogg and Simon Clarke were also there. Quasi and I discussed how to navigate the politics of it, both inside and outside government. We agreed that there was a triumvirate of problems. The Treasury, the Bank of England, and the OBR, which between them had presided over the drift of economic policy in Britain for 30 years. We knew they represented institutional barriers to our plans. Of these, we were most familiar with the Treasury. Quasi had been parliamentarily private secretary to Philip Hammond as Chancellor, when I had been Chief Secretary, so we both knew how bad the problem was there. We had to work out how we were going to approach this three-headed hydra. One option would be having to go in very hard, abolish the OBR, and appoint senior leaders in the Bank of England and Treasury who were prepared to challenge the orthodoxy. That would have been extremely dramatic and would have amounted to a declaration of war on the economic establishment. It would have also have taken time we didn't have. Instead, we decided to pick our battles. We would use the OBR on its twice-yearly cycle and try to work constructively with the governor and the bank. That left the Treasury itself. Quasi was very keen to replace the incumbent permanent secretary, Tom Scholar, with someone less attached to current thinking. While I didn't have particularly strong views about Scholar, I did believe it was important that the Chancellor of the Exchequer should be able to choose his most senior official. I therefore agreed that we should thank Scholar for his service on day one and set about appointing a new permanent secretary at the Treasury. The reaction to this announcement was predictable and telling. Former senior civil servants popped up on the airwaves to vent their outrage, attacking us for compromising civil service independence and saying the move would corrupt our system. Quasi had a clear idea whom he wanted to appoint as the new Treasury Permanent Secretary, an able and long-serving senior civil servant who had already had previous experience running a government department with an economic focus. But by the time we came to consider the appointment, some weeks later, events had rather overtaken us. A message was relayed to me from the Governor of the Bank of England that the markets might react badly if we installed our preferred candidate, who had not previously worked at the Treasury. Given the extent to which the markets took their cues from the signals given by the bank, it was not wholly clear if the governor's warning for a forecast or a threat. Whichever it was, it sadly had the desired effect. It was prevailed upon to block the appointment. We had struck the first blow against the existing economic establishment, but they had begun to strike back. In those days, at Sheving in late August, in continued scorching hot weather, the core economic ministers and I hammered out the details of the growth plan with Treasury officials with Simon Case also in attendance. We were essentially operating a government in waiting. There was no word of warning about any likely issues with the bond markets, and no one mentioned the issues surrounding liability-driven investments, the LDIs. Simon Clarke, who had been Chief Secretary to the Treasury for the previous 13 months, and the serving Chancellor's effective yet deputy, had not been made aware of any problems during his tenure. Although the mini-budget was politically punchy, it was in no way unprecedented in its scale or impact. Kwasi and I had made it clear that we were going to reduce debt and intended to bring forward new fiscal rules and a full spending review later in the autumn. This was a reasonable and credible plan, and it had been well trained in advance. The big tax measures were reversing proposed rises in corporation tax and national insurance. These were not in themselves tax cuts, but rather a freezing of taxes at their current rates. This was not a revolutionary prospectus. It was a return to the Conservative manifesto commitments on which we had won our parliamentary majority. We also decided to abolish the 45p rate of income tax. This tax was essentially an anti-success measure. The highest income tax in the US is 37%, and that only takes effect on incomes much higher than those affected by the upper rate in the UK. How were we supposed to remain competitive at 45%? The abolition of the 45% income tax rate was effectively revenue neutral, with the Institute for Fiscal Studies describing its effect as a rounding error in the context of public finances. And independent calculations from the Center of Economics and Business Research, the CEBR, suggesting that cutting the rate would raise money over 5 years. Jacob Rees-Mogg floated the idea of a flat tax, to which I am instinctively attracted, but we thought it would be a step too far at that point. We also wanted to abolish inheritance tax, and were planning that for the spring of 2023. The second part of the plan was supply-side reform, including changes to zoning and planning regulations and an energy package. We planned to set an upper ceiling on the cost of energy for consumers at £6,000, the energy price guarantee, as well as enact measures to support businesses dealing with the immediate issue of the broken UK market. We also planned to open up supply as quickly as possible, with more exploration in the North Sea and fracking. I was also in negotiations with the Norwegians about a long-term supply deal. The Treasury vastly overcosted the package because they based their calculations on the spot price for gas, not the future price curve. Their projection was £58 billion. In reality, it cost £30 billion. The energy price guarantee replaced the Rishi/Boris scheme, which paid money out regardless of what the market price was. This failed to provide security, but would have been at least as expensive. We replaced what had been a definitive cash outlay with a contingent liability. The Norwegian deal, or investing in new energy sources, would have been insurance against high prices. In any event, the Norwegians wouldn't give us a good enough deal, so we walked away. I think it's fair to say that our proactive, creative, commercial approach completely freaked out the Treasury. Treasury officials tried to work with their counterparts in the Energy Department to stop it happening. They tried to persuade the Chancellor it was a bad idea. The third part of the plan was about public spending restraint. We were deliberately careful about discussing public spending, given the very difficult politics of it. We planned to change the trajectory by holding spending down in an inflationary environment. Not reopening the spending review represented a tough approach. We also planned to limit the increase of benefits by wages, not prices, although it would turn out that the parliamentary party would not even support this. I fear that MPs have become addicted to spending. Compared to what the UK is spending now, my plans would have saved £18 billion in 2023-24 and £17 billion in 2024 to 2025. Even taking the Treasury's costings of tax cuts, my plans would have added less debt. All of the tax changes and supply-side reforms in the mini-budget were fully costed by the Treasury over 5 years, and I have already said I believe the Treasury costings to be over-egged. For example, their costing of the tax measures over 5 years was £45 billion, whereas independent analysis by the CEBR suggested it was £25 billion. And indeed, it was shown subsequently that the energy package was half the predicted cost. Even though I thought the Treasury costings were too high, as subsequent numbers have proven, there was no warning on the part of the Treasury that the market reaction would prove too much. Our exasperation of receiving a fair hearing was not only reinforced by the Treasury view, but by recent experience. There had not been a major market reaction against recent spending commitments, including the furlough scheme, which had cost £70 billion. In the greater scheme of things, the mini-budget's effect on government borrowing was relatively small, even if we took the inflated statistic modelling approach of the OBR and the Treasury, which placed its cost at £45 billion over the first 2 financial years. This compares to total government spending over 2 years of £2,000 billion. I have heard many people say we should have gone slower, delayed the announcements, and rolled the pitch better. I accept the communications around the mini-budget were not as good as they could have been, but I have to ask, what would we have been waiting for? I knew that many of these things would be politically difficult and immediately popular. The longer you wait in politics, the harder things become, and experience suggests it is better for politicians to strike while the iron is hot and make use of their mandate while it is still fresh. That might have been a miscalculation, but it was not an outlandish strategy. I came to the table having worked for years in the energy industry, both as an accountant and an economist. Hugh has a degree in mathematical economics from the London School of Economics. This stuff is bread and butter to us, and I talk about it a lot. I am not always good at translating the internal dialogue into something for wider public communication. I assume people understood what I was trying to do more than they did. I had been clear that I would cut taxes straight away during the leadership election, and had been elected by Conservative members on that platform. If anyone was surprised by the measures in the growth plan, they frankly hadn't been paying attention, or perhaps they had just become used to politicians who talk about wanting tax cuts while putting taxes up. By contrast, I meant what I said. Others criticised us for not publishing an OBR forecast alongside the plan, but as I have outlined, I had no confidence in the methodology I knew the OBR used and believed its modelling to be fundamentally flawed. Additionally, there have been no OBR forecasts for many other fiscal announcements, including the aforementioned £70 billion furlough package. The OBR later leaked its calculations, purporting to show a £70 billion hole in the budget, and this, once again, proved to be completely wrong. I don't regret not commissioning a forecast that I knew would be wrong and that would inevitably have undermined our plans from the outset. This led to criticism, but what else could I have done? Given that economic modelling was what I did in my professional career, I suppose I could have cleared a weekend at Checkers to crunch the numbers and write my own detailed forecast. But I hardly think that would have inspired confidence. This week's leading up to the launch of the growth plan were, of course, not as we had expected. Much of the financial preparation took place against the backdrop of national mourning for the Queen. During this period, I was kept busy travelling around the country attending ceremonies with the new King and Queen, while Kwasi and his team were working hard to get the package of measures together. In between my other commitments, I had regular meetings with Kwasi, my own economic advisor Matthew Sinclair, and Treasury officials to go through the details. Although the Prime Minister is nominally First Lord of the Treasury, Treasury officials guard the Chancellor closely, and were clearly alarmed by my close working relationship with Kwasi. By appointing him Chancellor, I knew I had a colleague who was fully signed up to this agenda and who was as keen as I was to deliver it. We knew we had to move fast. The death of Her Majesty meant that we could not stick to our original timetable, but once the mourning period was over, I believed it was the right time to get on with it. Throughout this time, I found the Treasury officials directly involved to be diligent and hard-working. They cooperated fully in pulling together the documents, working round the clock to meet the new deadline for what was now being dubbed the mini-budget. The deadline was Friday, the 23rd of September. At the end of a week, that would begin with the Queen's state funeral on Monday. I left for New York for the UN General Assembly immediately after the funeral, going straight to the airport from Windsor Castle. Some of my officials were nervous about my being away in the days immediately before such a significant announcement and thought I ought to have remained at home to oversee things. But I was satisfied with how preparations were going and assured them that it would all be fine. When I got back to the UK on Thursday morning, after an overnight flight, the final draft of the growth plan was just about ready. I reviewed the final changes and a memorandum for the Chancellor. I signed it off that evening and got an unusually early night. On the day of the mini-budget itself, I had hold a cabinet meeting at 8 AM to brief colleagues on the changes we would be outlining. Quasi went through the details, which were well received. I then headed to the House of Commons for the statement itself. I felt a huge sense of satisfaction as the Chancellor unveiled each of the measures in turn, culminating in the cuts to income tax before concluding by summarising up to our new approach. Mr. Speaker, for too long in this country, we have indulged in a fight over redistribution. Now we need to focus on growth, not just how we tax and spend. The Prime Minister promised that we would be a tax-cutting government. Today, we have cut stamp duty. We have allowed businesses to keep more of their own money to invest, to innovate and to grow. We have cut income tax and national insurance for millions of workers. We are securing our place in a fiercely competitive global economy with lower rates of corporation tax and lower rates of personal tax. We have promised to prioritize growth. We have promised a new approach for a new era. We have promised, Mr. Speaker, to release the enormous potential of this country. Our growth plans have delivered all those promises and more. I commend it to the House. As he sat down, there were cheers from our supporters on the Conservative benches behind us, but the reaction from some quarters of the party was muted. I was told later that many of the MPs who had backed my opponent in the leadership race remained poignantly silent during the speech and at its conclusion made their disapproval plain to all. None of that concerned me at the time. After the statement, I headed off to Kent with Quasi, paying a visit to a house-building firm to highlight the positive impact the growth plan would have on business. In the car on the way down, we talked enthusiastically about the need to get on with the next round of reforms and to keep up the momentum in the coming months. He was pleased with how the statement had gone, and I was ecstatic to have finally done the things we had talked about and planned for so long. Looking back, that afternoon was probably my happiest moment as Prime Minister. We had managed to deliver what we had said we would do. We had done it in spite of the resistance. Little did I know the establishment was about to use every tool at its disposal to fight back.